Hi, I'm Samantha Johnson. Welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up on this special edition of Beyond the Game.
Over 1,000 Russian athletes competing in summer, winter, and Paralympic sport can be identified as being involved in or benefiting from manipulation to conceal positive doping tests.
It's the report world sport has been waiting for, and part 2 of the McLaren Report was always going to be a bombshell. So it's all eyes on Russia as the world waits to hear its response to the final report. And after this damning verdict, what does the future hold for the Olympic movement? The biggest sports story of the year just got bigger. The McLaren Report, which reveals further allegations of widespread state-sponsored doping by the Russian government, has been released in London. Independent investigator for the World Anti-Doping Agency, Richard McLaren, says that the Russian officials performed a cover-up that operated on an unprecedented scale. So, with a bombshell like that, let's begin our coverage with Jonathan Crane, who's in London.
Another hotel conference room, another grim day for the integrity of sport. It might feel like déjà vu, but this is a catalogue of corruption that keeps adding new chapters and containing more and more Russian athletes.
For years, international sports competitions have unknowingly been hijacked by the Russians. Coaches and athletes have been playing on an uneven field. Sports fans and spectators have been deceived. It's time that stops. Yes, stops.
In his first report into Russian cheating, McLaren revealed how hundreds of positive tests were recorded as negative and how at the Sochi Winter Olympics, under the direction of Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, tainted urine samples were swapped with clean ones through a hole in the wall. Now, a slew of evidence to back this up. The report detailed how the methods used to stop Russian athletes failing drug tests were forced to evolve as detection methods and regulations changed.
Our investigation has revealed that for every action by WADA, there was a Russian reaction.
As for the master plan, a Secret Service-backed plot to switch samples, there was proof that supposedly tamper-proof bottles were indeed broken into, with telltale scratch marks. Salt and even coffee granules were added to mimic the tainted sample. Testing in some cases showed the levels of salt in that urine was not even humanly possible. This form of cheating continued well beyond Sochi.
Very quickly, we learned that there was a lot more going on than just what went on at Sochi. And once we learned that, and it was early days in the investigation, then yes, we were more than surprised or astonished at the potential scope of what was going on. And then it's taken us, I guess, 7 months to really have a clearer picture of the enormity of what's happened.
WADA will hope this report now silences the critics, especially those within the IOC. They were angry at the timing of the last report, just before the Olympics, and critical at the lack of detail despite the widespread claims. So this then a vindication of sorts for WADA and McLaren. But over in Russia, they're taking quite a different stance.
Two-time Olympic pole vault champion Yelena Isinbayeva has been perhaps the most outspoken. Now an anti-doping official, she thinks Russian athletes have been unfairly singled out.
Of course, it's within my interests to prevent the situation which I came under. I want to make sure treatment of sportsmen from our country is the same as the treatment for all other sportsmen, so that it isn't biased, only because we are being accused of absolutely everything possible.
It's fair to say Russia hasn't exactly been jumping through hoops to admit its guilt. Even now, officials continue to deny the cover-up reached the highest levels of government.
Of course, we do not agree with the statements that there was allegedly a state-sponsored doping support system. This is not true. There never has been such a system in Russia.
The IOC, meanwhile, has thanked McLaren for his report and bemoaned a, quote, fundamental attack on the integrity of the Olympic Games. It's already launched 2 separate investigations into McLaren's findings and will be passed his evidence. But now more than ever, Thomas Bach and his organisation are under pressure to come down hard on the cheats. For many, only blanket bans will do.
So, where do we start? Well, let's discuss everything we know from the most recent doping revelations with the investigative journalist Declan Hill. Declan, thank you very much for talking to Beyond the Game. Now, you've been following this story very...
Not at all. Yak Shamlar. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. Now, you've been following this story very closely. You were at the press conference today. Just
Yes.
how big is this scandal and how deep does it go?
Well, look, you know, what was discussed today and what's coming out in these reports is really comparable with what that awful kind of dungeon of horrors that we saw coming out of East Germany back in the 1970s and 80s, where these, you know, intellectual thugs that were the East German Sports Administration turned young girls, teenage girls, you know, effectively into men by systematic doping. We're up there now. This is the kind of scale that we're talking about. And by the way, before we move on any further, the Russians do have a good point. There's lots of doping. There's lots of doping in other sports. There's lots of doping in other countries. But what we've seen coming out of the evidence from the McLaren Report is truly state-sponsored doping, which at the moment we haven't seen in any other countries.
Well, Vitaly Mutko is once again considered in the middle of all of this, but he manages to avoid direct implication. We've had many guests saying that he's very much the puppet master of world football. Is it the case that it's the same regarding the Olympics?
Well, look, again, getting back to basics, this is a story that moves far beyond sport. This is really geopolitics writ large. You know, sitting and talking and standing next to the Russian journalists, there was no doubt about what side they were on. They were in attack dog mode and really felt that this was some kind of Cold War plot. However, having looked, having read the report's up on the internet, online, the evidence is pretty substantial that the Russian government, the sports ministers, were basically looking at you know, Russian athletes tested positive for doping and gone da or niet. Who are we going to help cover up? Who are we not going to help cover up?
So do the Russians have a point saying that this is completely politically motivated, this attack on Russian sport?
Oh gosh, no. The Russians have a point in that there's doping. Lots of other people are doping. There's absolutely no question about that. And there's absolutely no question that there could be other state-sponsored people helping their athletes dope. There's no question about it. But in terms of the evidence that people have now, this is it. I mean, this is really something extraordinary.
Okay, well, what about the other countries that might be implicated in terms of doping? I mean, like you said before, Russia aren't the only ones that are implicated in doping.
Well, look, I mean, now we're moving from rock-hard DNA evidence, you know, insider whistleblower testimony into something else. I mean, what we saw today was hard legal evidence. You know, there are a number of documentaries by the great German documentary maker Hayo Seppel, who was the guy that started all this. He was the guy that convinced the Stepanovas to come forward and whistleblow on this case. He went to Kenya before the start of the last Olympics and really had a good long look at the corruption in Kenyan running. There's all kinds of stuff like that. But look, getting back to basics, we've got legal proof now that there was a state-sponsored doping going on in Russia. We just don't have that kind of similar standard of legal proof anywhere else.
Okay, final question, and just a very quick answer. How badly does this reflect on the IOC, considering they didn't ban Russia from the Olympics, but the IPC did?
Yeah, look, I think this whole thing has been a complete and utter disaster. First of all, it's been a complete and utter disaster for the Russian athletes that have wanted to compete clean. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the McLaren Report has shown that if you wanted to compete clean, you had a lot of problems, you had a lot of challenges to jump over inside Russia. And that's really victimization. Two, it's victimized all the athletes around the world that have been trying to compete cleanly. I mean, really, this has affected the London Summer Olympics we found today, the University Games, the Sochi Olympics, the IAAF World Championship in 2013. It was ongoing after the Sochi Olympics. So if you're a clean athlete, wherever you are, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in Canada, wherever you are in the world, and you see these reports coming out and you see this evidence, you've got to be bouncing off the wall saying, you know, what was I doing? I mean, this turned my sport into political theatre.
All right, Declan, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. So, as we know, the IOC are talking tough. Thomas Bach refused to ban Russia from the 2016 Rio Games when the first report was released. Many claimed political motives due to his relationship with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. But now, in light of the release, he's suggesting extreme measures for doping cheats.
Professor McLaren's completed report demonstrates a fundamental attack on the integrity of sport. For me, as an Olympian, any athlete or official who took part in such a sophisticated manipulation system should be excluded for life from any participation in the Olympic Games in whatever capacity.
And that's the interesting thing to note from this whole unfolding story has been the reaction from the different agencies which rule the sport. Take the International Paralympic Committee, for example. They were the only sports body to ban the whole Russian team from the Rio Games a few months ago. And they're on the front foot again, stating the full findings of the report are unprecedented and astonishing. They strike right at the heart of the integrity and ethics of sport. We wholeheartedly agree with Professor McLaren that the best course of action is to work together to fix the broken and compromised anti-doping system in Russia. Well, as expected, Russia's sporting circles reacted strongly about the new revelations concerning Russia's involvement in state-sponsored doping. Daria Bondarchuk has more on this.
The Kremlin said it is studying the latest report published by Professor McLaren on doping in Russian sports, but did not provide a detailed comment on recent revelations. The Russian Sports Ministry also said it is studying the report in order to give a constructive response, but ensured that there is no state-backed system of doping in support of doping in Russia, and never was. Other Russian sports officials and heads of some sports associations have said that have dismissed this report as ungrounded, saying that there's no evidence or proof provided by Professor McLaren to support his claims. Now, on the eve of this publication, Russian Olympic Committee has held a meeting, and the head of Russian Olympic Committee, Alexander Zhukov, said that all athletes and officials that are implicated in Mr. McLaren's report will be given a chance by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to explain themselves and defend their case. The International Olympic Committee just several days ago has extended sanctions against Russia over earlier doping allegations that include the halt on all international sports competitions to be held in Russia, as well as suspension of Russian athletes and officials implicated in the doping scandal from participation in international sports events. That, of course, puts under question whether Russia will have enough time to clear its case ahead of the next Winter Olympics. Russia has claimed since this report, the first part of this report came out earlier this year, and has taken steps in order to strengthen its doping control mechanisms and tighten its anti-doping legislation. It has also set up a public anti-doping committee and has voiced its position that it is ready for dialogue and it is ready to improve its anti-doping practices, but it is not clear whether this will be enough to assure the IOC, the IPC, WADA and other international sports officials that Russia has done enough in order to clear itself from allegations.
All right, so how does Russian sport maintain such conviction in the face of such a huge amount of evidence? Well, let's ask the sports specialist, Alan Moore, who's waiting for us in Moscow. Alan, thank you for talking to us. Now, considering the amount of allegations and evidence against the Russians in the McLaren report, how can they carry on denying it?
Well, they're not denying that there were, let's say, criminal acts or misdemeanors here. I think it's the wording especially is quite troublesome for most people. I mean, I would agree in a large way that the word state-sponsored is accurate, because everything here in Russia is state-sponsored. Because athletes can't survive on their own. It's not like they get a Nike contract and you can buy their drugs through that way. So anything they get from the government then is seen as sponsored and state-sponsored. But they're kind of a little bit wary over how it's being phrased, because legally it's a minefield in any case. And the same for the IOC and WADA as well, because all of these great organisations, WADA, IOC, they've all failed the athletes and failed sports in general, and continue to do so, because even though Russia, there are many issues, and as earlier your guest said, Declan Hill said, it's not just Russia. There are issues here, they have to be fixed, but we have to go the right way about to do it, to fix them.
Well, what is the next step for Russia? Will there be reforms?
Well, Samantha, already they have begun. I mean, they've begun a while ago, where, especially this summer, at a very local level, where it really needs to begin. It is, I'll give an example, in Ulyanovsk Oblast region, they have fair, clean sport that they've brought in for school children, for teenagers, to educate children, parents and coaches that, look, go out and enjoy sports, play sports. If you feel or you think you need to dope, or are told you need to dope in order to improve your career or to compete at an elite level, then it's no longer sport, and get out and report it. It needs to be taken out at a very fundamental level, because you know, as we know, you can walk into a gym anywhere from Ankara to London to Dublin to Moscow and pick up any number of harmful substances that will make you look better, make you run faster, make you lift more weights. We have to get past that and actually look at, like, what are we doing for sports, and do we want our children to partake in something that's going to damage them physically and mentally in the long run?
Okay, last question, and a very quick answer, please. From the reaction we've seen on the streets of Moscow, this attack on Russian sport is purely politically motivated. Where does that idea come from?
Oh, I mean, there's always elements of politics in sport. A lot of people feel that because, it's kind of going around that it's non-stop anti-Russia, anti-Russia. That's what they're made to believe. It's not just the local media. I think it's just a general feeling. And any country that's mentioned in such negative ways, they will react. However, I think most people here, in fairness, are more concerned about getting gifts for New Year's than doping and some rich athletes. So I think that there's a little bit of justification in it, but at the same time, I think people need to look and say, will we do better after this? Can we clean up our sport and forget the outside world? Let's make Russia better.
Okay, Alan, thank you very much. Okay, let's reset and bring you up to date with the latest from the McLaren Report. Now, the final report states that more than 1,000 Russian athletes across 30 sports were involved or benefited from an institutional conspiracy of doping in a cover-up which dates back to at least 2011. The techniques of the Russian officials to fool drug testers went to extreme lengths, which included using salt and coffee granules in urine samples to trick the testers. Russian President Vladimir Putin is not mentioned in the report, and while Vitaly Mutko, the Deputy Prime Minister, is implicated via his department, there is no direct evidence that he knew of or instituted the doping program. Russian Olympic teams corrupted London Games on unprecedented scales. The corruption at London 2012 will probably never be established, but many Russian athletes who competed in the Games were part of the doping program. So the question is, what can sport do to make sure this never happens again? Let's begin by asking Jens Andersen. He's the International Director for Play the Game, a Danish institute aimed at strengthening the ethical foundation of sport. Thank you very much for joining us, Jens. Now, we're in the middle of the biggest attack on the ethics of fair play and the Olympic ideals. How is it being seen there in Denmark?
Well, we try to keep not only a Danish view, but a broader view on things. But I think that in our part of the world, and that does not only go for the Danish government, but for most of Western Europe, there is a very, very deep concern that the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested of taxpayers' money since the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency some 17 years ago, that all these fortunes have been wasted, or at least are only very partially effective. There is now very much a concern also about how the international sports movement has reacted to this, because so far the IAAF and the International Paralympic Committee have set an example of a very hardline policy that very few other federations, including the International Olympic Committee, have had an appetite to follow. I think if you noticed what Thomas Bach said here, it sort of frames the challenge. Thomas Bach said, oh, he would certainly be ready to ban any official, any athlete for life. He focuses on the individuals. But what the McLaren Report now and the chapter 1 of the McLaren Report, plus the former water reports on corruption and doping in the IAAF in Russia, really demonstrates is that this is not a question of individual behavior. This is not some corrupt official here and there or one cheating athlete. It's about a system that produces cheaters in order to win national prestige and in some cases also money.
Okay, and just quickly, what does world sport do now? I mean, can we start all over again? I mean, is the Olympic ideals broken now?
It is going to be very, very hard to reconstruct the confidence between the parties in the anti-doping fight. You must know that this is one very unique area where governments and international sports organizations share the power and has done so for 17 years. But there is a clear, low-key, behind-the-curtain war going on the direction of the future anti-doping fight. It's a war about who's going to pay the bills, but it's certainly also a war about who can we trust. Because now we have seen that international federations are ready to cheat at all costs, and we have seen that governments are also ready to cheat. So who can we trust? Governments and the sport? It's not an easy answer, and we need all good, as McLaren said today, all good wills have to cooperate to restore public confidence in the anti-doping struggle.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Lens. Let's move on now. So, how must it feel to have all your hard work ruined by a doping athlete? Years of training and sacrifice to find out that person who beat you cheated. Let's ask Andrew Steele, who's a British runner and competed in the 2008 Olympic Games. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, what was your reaction when you heard today?
Well, I guess like the McLaren Report is quite shocking, actually, in just the scale and the extent that people have gone to cheat the system, and in this case, like almost to the highest level. So it's very much a kind of a cocktail for the worst things that could happen to the sport. Actually, you know, individuals implicated, people higher up the chain implicated. So it's a very, very unfortunate situation. Like, this is great that this investigative report has been done and we can find this out, but it's really a shame that this was happening, and it's really, really sad for the integrity of sport and for what people watch on screen to know that this has been going on for so long.
Well, you train almost all of your life to get Olympic glory. How does it make you feel to know that the person who beat you has been cheating?
Well, in my case, we finished fourth in the 4x400 meter relay back in Beijing in 2008. And ahead of us were the Russian team. And one of those athletes, upon retest some 8 years later of his original sample from the Beijing Games, actually they found an adverse analytical finding. So effectively, the Russian team have been, I guess, sort of, retrospectively banned, which for me is obviously, it's a very bizarre situation. I missed out on being on the podium all those years ago. That was the closest I came to real success in my career. So it's a shame to have missed out on that. But either way, I'm glad that in some way that someone can be caught eventually. And I think this idea of keeping samples, retesting them in the future, is a great deterrent to stop athletes cheating in the first place.
Okay, very quickly, have the Olympic Games lost their way? Is winning that important that people feel the need to cheat?
Well, this report in particular definitely shows that certain countries, federations have definitely lost their way. This isn't just Russia. We need this kind of resource and effort applied to every single federation, actually, in order to really bring everything back on track. And I believe we will. I think this is the first stage in a sort of very good, clean future.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much for speaking to Beyond the Game, and well done on your bronze. That's it from us at Beyond the Game. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy your weekend and we'll catch you next time. Bye.